The BC RCMP providing an update into that investigation into Tuesday's mass shooting. Here to provide a little more clarity on what we heard is Chris Lewis. He's the former OPP Commissioner and CTV News Public Safety Analyst. Chris, thanks so much for joining us.
Good afternoon, Mike. Good to talk to you again.
First, I wanted to ask you, what information stood out to you in that news conference and what police were saying?
A couple of things, mostly around the firearms, Mike. Of course, there's been a real thirst for knowledge around the fact that the RCMP at some point had calls to that residence and seized firearms. And at some point, they were ordered returned to the lawful owner. We don't know who that lawful owner is, and we don't know what firearms they were. But of the 4 firearms seized in this investigation, 2 in the residence and 2 at the high school, the RCMP Deputy Commissioner confirmed that at least 1 at each location were not known to them, so they had not been previously seized. Although he has said they're still investigating the history of the other 2, he was unable to confirm whether or not they had ever been in the possession of the Mounties and subsequently those that were returned to that residence at one point. The other thing that really struck me was the fact of the bedlam and the sheer horror that 2 RCMP officers would have responded to in that big school. And a child yelled, or someone yelled from an upper floor window that the shooter was on the 2nd floor. So they went up that staircase, found a body along the way. I don't know if it was a deceased person or an injured, continued on and confronted that shooter, and the killer committed suicide. So, I mean, just I've heard it a million times over the last few days and thought about it a lot, but it still really struck me how difficult that was and how brave those RCMP officers were. You know, and despite all the tragedy and the awful situation there, that piece, because I was an officer, I did police small towns, that really struck me as to how that would have impacted them.
And police also underlining the fact that once police entered the school or at least engaged with that individual, with the suspect, they say that no other lives were lost, and certainly underlining the importance of how quickly they responded, Chris.
Exactly. And in a small town, there's only 2 working. You know, I police a town that exact same size, sometimes alone, and I might have been 10 miles outside of town when I got a call. I never got a call like that, obviously. But, you know, so it's fortunate they were close by, but it's heroic that they responded the way they did into a situation where they may have had kids at the school. They would likely have known staff, other kids at the school, their parents. It's a small town. Everybody knows one another, and the RCMP are part of that community. So very difficult for them, but very heroic efforts.
Now, police didn't say anything about the suspect's online activities. They also weren't asked in that news conference. But how significant is that part of this investigation?
I think it's going to be very significant. I mean, there have been some unconfirmed reports of conversations on Reddit and things that the killer may have posted at some point. If, in fact, they're true, and that remains to be seen, they're very telling in terms of the alleged relationship, you know, in relation to the transgender issue and some, you know, issues within the community around the fact that the individual was transitioning. So, you know, was that part of it or not? There's certainly a lot of public attention over pronouns right now. The bottom line is a male that was transitioning to female killed a pile of innocent people. And so what he or she was called at that moment in time, I think, is really, you know, very insignificant when you look at what are the real issues at play here, the loss of kids.
And I wanted to come back to the guns for just a moment. You know, tracing and trying to figure out which guns had been seized, which ones had not been. How key is that for police in this moment to understand, you know, how this happened and you know, how to prevent others in the future?
Well, you know, it's interesting from a policing perspective in terms of lessons learned. It won't impact the outcome of this investigation. But if, in fact, if police had returned weapons to a residence where there was someone that was a threat to themselves or a threat to others, and if they knowingly did so, you know, given that the actual person that ended up being the killer was still living there at the time, then that would be questioned. But what we don't know is whose guns were they, who the court ordered them returned to, was the killer living there at that time, what was the association. I just can't imagine that, knowing that someone's a potential threat like that, police would ultimately return weapons to them. And I don't believe that's what happened here. But what was that? There's different possibilities around that. And for the RCMP to learn from that, in terms of did they do the right thing, did they not do the right thing, etc. We're not looking for scapegoats here, but we're looking to make sure processes are handled properly, and if not, how can they be handled more properly in future.
Yeah, and certainly that is something I'm sure that the police want to make sure. You know, as they continue to do a number of these interviews, the police said that they also did 80 interviews so far with students, educators, and first responders. How key will that be going forward in really trying to make sure that they are doing as thorough investigation as they can to not only give the rest of Canada that kind of answer to what happened and why it did, but especially to that community who will be asking these questions as well?
For sure. I mean, that's a difficult process because they're interviewing kids that were injured, kids that were witnesses, kids that lost friends, teachers that witnessed carnage and had their own lives threatened and threatened the lives of the kids they were in charge of threatened. I mean, those are tough interviews. 80 interviews you could bang off in a couple of days in some cases, not in this case. This is big, complex, long interviews and very emotional. So that's challenging, but to really paint the picture of what not only what occurred that day, but what's the history of the killer within that school and other people that would know the killer. And so kind of painting that picture is important. And we still want to know, did the killer say or do anything that would indicate a threat was imminent to anybody? Because quite often after these events, we talk to people or hear from people that say, well, now I know what he meant here or she meant there, or these people meant when they said X, Y, or Z. And so, and quite often that's very telling. And so what can we learn from that too, to encourage people to come forward when they suspect somebody may be a threat to themselves or to others?
Okay, certainly a lot that we were going to be waiting for in terms of details going forward. Chris Lewis, former OPP commissioner and CTV News public safety analyst. Thank you so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Michael.